Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming out in the weather, as Caitlin mentioned. So as she already introduced, my name is Gabe, and I just finished my Ph.D. in September, studying how the brain tracks the beat in music and how this makes you want to move. So how many people have experienced this, where they listen to music and then before they know it, you're bobbing your head, you're tapping your foot, and it's fun, right? And you enjoy it. So how many people here sing or play an instrument? And we all listen to music, I assume. And how many dancers do we have? Okay, a few. Exactly, right? Okay, so I'm going to start talking about what is groove, and then we'll talk about what about music makes it groovy, and then we'll talk about what happens in the brain when all of this happens. So what is groove? Oh, where's this? Okay, I unmuted it. We're going to try it again.
Groovy, baby.
So you often when I hear the term groovy, I can't help but think of the 60s. Another sort of top-of-mind example of groovy music is probably Stevie Wonder. And then maybe a more modern-day example, there are a lot of people who dance to EDM, or electronic dance music. So all very different kinds of groove, admittedly, but all of them make you want to move. And so I guess I'm going to start by acknowledging that I think preference and familiarity is a big part of this. So what grooves for one person isn't going to be what grooves for somebody else. But I still think that there are some sort of universal things about certain kinds of music that make us move. So what is groove? Let's try and drill down on a definition. So this is a quote from a book. I think it's actually his published dissertation of Tiger Roholt. And this is on the first page, and this is his definition of groove, and I really enjoy it. It's winter. A heavy snow has fallen. The plows have yet to clear the street on which you're driving, but the snow has been packed down by the early morning traffic. As you change lanes, you slide just a bit. Then you feel your tires settle into the grooves made by the tires of other cars. You have some sense of the firmness and path of these grooves, less by actually seeing them, more through your body. You perceive or grasp these grooves both in your hand through the resistance in the steering wheel and in your body as you feel the car being pulled, pushed, and carried along. He goes on to say that in a musical groove, the musician, dancer, or listener has a similar feeling of being pulled along with the music, guided into a musical notch. And musicians will often call this place the pocket, or terms like flow state come up here too. And in my experience of the groove, this is all sort of tied together and makes a lot of sense to me. In 2012, Peter Giannotta ran a study, so a psych study, where he had participants endorse. He had various statements, and he asked them to endorse them as to whether they thought that this statement had to do with what groove meant to them. And one of the top statements that everybody endorsed was this one, that the groove depends on the extent to which the music makes you want to move. And so in my research, at least, this is sort of the definition that I've taken to use, and I've started to use the word groove less and started to use the phrase music that makes you want to move more. Guy Madison had an even more scientific-sounding definition, wanting to move some part of the body in relation to some aspect of the sound pattern. So he's being very specific here about you're synchronizing the movements of your body with the patterns that are in the music. So historically, music and movement have been linked together for a long time. It's not a recent thing by any means. So mothers and babies, mothers rocking their babies to sleep and singing to them, there's very much marrying between the music and the movement that the infant is responding to. Marching bands or armies marching off to war, all synchronizing their steps, all together with the music, brings everyone together and makes them feel as one. And then, of course, dancing in nightclubs and hanging out with friends. It's an enjoyable experience. It's fun. So even aliens have an idea of what groove sounds like. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this show, Third Rock from the Sun. I'm going to play you a short little clip here, but the premise of the show is that these four are aliens from another planet who've come to discover what there is on Earth. And it's a pretty funny show, I recommend it, but this clip in particular is pretty relevant.
Primitive technology. I wonder if the people on this planet will ever discover the superior sound of vinyl.
So what kind of music did you get?
I just told him to surprise me.
Well, this is surprising.
Why am I doing this?
Same reason I'm doing this, I suppose. This is very powerful.
I'm feeling funky.
This is not good. I can't stop! Nobody panic! Let's get out of here!
That's what you feel like sometimes too, right? So what is it about music that makes us want to move? So in that same study I was talking about before, in 2012, one of the other statements that was highly endorsed by participants was that the groove depends on the presence of a strong underlying beat. And so the beat is something I wanted to talk about right now. And we're going to use Michael Jackson as an example. So how many people here know what I mean when I say the beat? I feel like it's a pretty common thing to understand what it means, but it's not something you have to define too often. So I think what I'm going to try and do is define this by example. So I haven't tried this before, and there's not as many people here as I thought, but we're going to go for it with a little bit of audience participation. So I'm going to turn the audience, and myself, I guess, into the drum kit for Billie Jean. Is everybody on board with that? Yes? And we're going to have some examples to help us. So how do I want to do this? We're going to go in 3 sections, I think, okay? So I'm going to divide down the middle. This is going to be one, and there's more people on this side. So maybe about where the railing on the stairs is, we can cut it in half. So we have 1, 2, and 3. So this side, I'm going to start, and I want you guys to do the bass drum and the snare drum. So if you can stomp your feet and clap your hands like this. Like that. There we go. And then the front here, I want you guys to be the hi-hat. So maybe you can just tap your thighs. There we go. Maybe we'll drop the bass. And then at the back, you guys are going to do the fun part. So this is the syncopated part, and it's going to get really groovy now. Are you ready? Okay, keep going, keep going. Yeah. All right, awesome. Give yourselves a hand. Oh, I guess I didn't step through the slide. Okay, so I wanted to do that because I wanted you to feel what it's like to be in the groove. And I guess it'll make more sense when we get to the end of my talk, but the difference between the beat and the rhythm that's going on and feeling the space in there is really integral to feeling the groove, in my opinion. So here's, I meant to put this up while we were doing it, but here's all the different parts that were going on. So we had the bass drum and the snare drum. This was you guys, so. And then the hi-hat was carried through, and then the synth was the syncopated part. And if you'll notice, I find this part really interesting. This is a bit of a side note, but the bass line, it has this same note in line with the syncopated synth part. And so it's as if the bass line kind of is syncopated on its own. So let's talk about syncopation. So syncopation tends to be defined as a rhythm where notes occur on parts of the beat that you don't expect them to be. So an interesting thing about a beat or a meter is that different beats in time will have different, I've called it metric strength here. Another word you could use is expectancy. So you have a real strong feeling that there's going to be a note that happens on beat 1, and that's the song sets up this expectancy for you. The second highest, most likely place you're going to expect a note to happen is on the third beat. And if you'll notice, on the slide previous, that's where the kick drum hits were. And you can see how it works out there. So the beginning of the bass line occurs on beat 1, and of course that's obviously very expected. This note of the bass line, which was also the second hit of that synth line, occurs on a really unexpected place. And so that note could be called like the syncopated note. And what is actually done in research is you assign a weight to each of these beat locations based on how expected a note is there. And then you can calculate the difference between for how syncopated a note is. So if there's a note that occurs here and the position right after it has a higher expectancy, then the difference between those two is how syncopated that note is. Does that make sense to everybody? So using that idea, there was a study that was run by Maria Wittek in Denmark, where she had participants rate a bunch of drum patterns. So she took a bunch of drum patterns from music and then also created a bunch of her own to get a good spread of this syncopation index, and had people rate them on how much they enjoyed listening to them and how much the rhythms made them want to move. And this is what she found. So on the y-axis here is ratings of wanting to move. So higher is they wanted to move more. And across the x-axis is syncopation degree. And so something really interesting came out. It's this inverted U pattern. So it seems like there's sort of an optimal amount of syncopation degree in the middle, where people want to move along the most. And I mean, colloquially, this makes sense to me too. So a rhythm that's not syncopated at all, like a metronome, like something like this, doesn't really compel me to move necessarily. Something like Billie Jean, a little bit more. But then something that's really crazy and complicated and you can't even find the beat in there at all, that again doesn't make you want to move. So there's this sweet spot in terms of syncopation for how much it makes you want to move. Okay. So let's move over to the brain. So what happens in the brain when we feel the urge to move to music? So I'm going to tackle this question in a couple parts. And this is what my Ph.D. research focused on. So first we're going to talk about where in the brain we might expect this to happen. And we'll talk about how. And then lastly, we'll talk about why the brain might be doing this. Okay, so where? So this is what a brain looks like. Has everybody seen a brain before? Maybe in pictures. So there's not a head drawn on here, but this is the front, that's the back, that's the top. And it's about the size, just a little bit smaller than your head. So parts of the brain that have been found to be involved in music perception are auditory parts, obviously. So this is the part of the brain that processes sounds that you hear, all kinds of sounds, whether it's speech or music or my feet stomping on the stage. And premotor areas. So one thing I'll say too is that the way the brain's organized, the part of the brain that controls your movements is, oh, I have a pointer. The part of the brain that controls your movements is right here, kind of in the middle. And then the part of the brain that plans those movements is right beside it, premotor. And then there's kind of more premotor areas that fall towards the front, but this is what we're mostly interested in. And so premotor areas have been implicated in music perception. So it's really interesting that this is the case. Okay, so the way that we tackle this, I'm going to do a bit of a tangent and then come back. So the way that we tackle the where question in neuroscience is usually using something called fMRI. I'm sure everyone's heard of what an fMRI is, or an MRI, and so there's a difference between the two. So this is sort of what the machine looks like. It's a big circular magnet that you slide into laying down, and you have to stay very still. And you can take basically two kinds of pictures with this kind of a machine. So you can do a structural MRI, where you would take a picture of someone's brain. Now, you're not looking at any activity doing this. You're just taking a picture of it. This is actually my brain, by the way. Yeah, sure. It goes right across. Yeah, it's on both sides. And it's the case where like the right side controls the left and the right. Yeah. Yeah. So structural MRI or functional MRI. And so this picture over here is both. So you've got the structural MRI picture, and then you've got these red blobs on there. So what functional MRI is measuring is blood flow. And so what happens is in these studies is you have somebody does a task, and then they'll scan your brain while you're doing it and immediately afterwards. And what shows up as the red blotches is where blood is rushing to after the task has happened. So they're not actually measuring what's happening in the neurons. They're measuring what happens in the blood vessels around the neurons. And so the way neurons work is that it doesn't cost anything to fire, but then it costs to reset. And so that's what the blood is needed for. And so this is why fMRI studies, they have very poor temporal resolution. So they can't hone in on something like, is this part of the brain tracking the beat per se? They can just say, oh, this part of the brain is active, and we know that 3 seconds later there was blood flow to that area, so we know it was doing something. But we can't really say anything about the time course of the activity. What MRI is really good at, though, is spatial resolution. You can get a picture to a really precise amount, which is good. Okay, so if I go back to what parts of the brain are active when you listen to music. So this is a study by Jessica Gran and, I forget his first name, Gran and Brett in 2007. Jessica Gran's at Western right now, where they had participants tap along to different rhythms. And they had created these rhythms to be, some of them were beat rhythms, they called them, so it was very obvious that there was a beat. And some of them were non-beat rhythms, so it was very difficult to find the beat. But the task was to tap along with the rhythm. And then they had them go into the MRI scanner, and they listened to these rhythms again. And what they found was that for the rhythms that the participants were better at tapping to, motor areas were active when they listened to them. And so I feel I should say that when they were listening to these rhythms in the scanner, they weren't moving at all, but motor planning areas are active. And so I find this very, very interesting, and it's really fascinating that you're not moving, you're just listening to music, but parts of your brain that control your body and your movements of your body are very much engaged and active in this task. So there's a lot of information on this picture, but and we're now looking at the brain from a different angle, as you can probably tell. So the first pictures were from the side. This one you're looking straight on, and this one you're looking from the top. So the premotor area is kind of here, because this slice is taken from the middle, and then this is auditory areas down here. So parts of your brain that control movement are active when you're just listening to music. That's the take-home message there. Okay, how? So how does the brain track the beat in music? Okay, so this is a neuron. It looks a little bit like a tree, but it's a neuron. So this is what we call the cell body. This is the axon. And so when a neuron fires, it kind of charges up here, and it goes this way, and it fires onto the next neuron. Now, something about neurons that's interesting is that they don't sort of fire in isolation. Neurons tend to fire in a periodic way. And neurons additionally tend to have a preferred rate of firing. So you'll have neurons that prefer to fire at, say, 120 BPM. You'll have other neurons that prefer to fire at 130 BPM, and so on. Like so. Another thing that neurons tend to do is they'll tend to synchronize their firing with whatever they're connected to. So if this is an auditory neuron and it's connected to your ears, and you start hearing a metronome, then this neuron's going to spontaneously fire and synchronize its firing with that metronome. If this is a motor neuron and it's connected to your hands clapping, and there's a signal sent to clap at a certain rate, then those neurons will start to fire at that rate, and they'll pass that on down the line. So what this means is that these neurons tend to be organized in banks of frequency-tuned neurons, and so you'll have a whole row of them that all respond to different frequencies. So when you listen to Billie Jean, for example, that's at 120 BPM or around there, then it's the neurons that are at 120 that are going to start firing the most. Obviously, there are other frequencies present, but okay, so I was going to do a metronome demo that looks kind of like that, but I couldn't get the metronomes to work. And so what we're going to do instead is I'm going to show you a video. Oh, right, and we embedded the video. Has anyone seen a video like this before? Okay, so if you take two metronomes and you set them to the same frequency and you set them on the table and you start them both, they'll both be going at the same rate, but they're probably not going to be ticking at the same time unless you manage to start them exactly the same. And even if you did, they're probably going to drift a little bit. So they're not in phase with one another. They're at the same frequency, but they're not in phase. A neat little trick is that if you put these metronomes on a board and then put them on top of two pop cans, say, so that there's no friction between them, then they'll eventually synchronize. And then you can take them off again and put them back on the table, and they'll kind of run out of phase. So it's a cool video, and I'm going to show it to you, but I'm using it as an analogy to how this neural entrainment works. So if you think of maybe these four metronomes can represent neurons that are tuned to 120 BPM, and this metronome on the end is maybe the music that you're listening to. And so before you start listening to the music, so when the metronomes are just on the table, they're all out of phase. But once you start listening to it and you put the metronomes on the pop cans, then they start to go in phase, and the neurons sort of spontaneously synchronize. Pretty neat. Excuse me. Okay, so how do we measure this? How do we measure neural entrainment? The answer is EEG. So MRI is not really a good technology for this because we need really good temporal resolution. And MRI doesn't have very good temporal resolution, but EEG does. So how does EEG work? Okay, we're going to come back to our neuron. So when a neuron fires, I don't want to get too deep into the details, but at sort of the moment, at one moment when it fires, you'll end up with sort of a positive end and a negative end because there's negative charge kind of flowing through. I know I'm not speaking exactly here. So if you were to put like an electrode beside this neuron, then you could measure the change in electrical potential as this happens. But of course, EEG is electrodes on the scalp, and a single neuron isn't going to create enough to be able to measure it there. But if you get a bunch of these neurons that are all lined up and they're all firing at the same rate together, then it sort of amplifies the signal and it becomes measurable on the surface of the scalp. And so you can see that if you were to put electrodes around this head, you would measure negative there and positive there, and that's how it would work. So a good analogy that I like to use for this is the sky dome. If you imagine that there are a bunch of people sitting in the sky dome, and each one of them is a neuron, and you were trying to measure them with some microphones put on the outside, it would be really hard to hear one person. But if they all started yelling together and yelling the same thing, then it would probably become audible on the microphone. Okay, so instead of microphones, we have electrodes. And this is what, again, instead of 5 of them like I had in the picture, I was using 128. And for the musicians in the room, this is what it looks like on the computer when you record it. It's kind of like a massive recording session with 128 channels. Your sampling rate's only 512. It's not 44.1, but that's what it looks like. So one of the first studies measuring neural entrainment was in 2011 by Sylvie Nazaridan, and it was a really, really interesting study. So she used EEG and played people, it wasn't music and it wasn't a metronome, it was kind of like, what do they call it? Amplitude modulated noise, and so it kind of sounded like a wobble, 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 wobble. And it had a beat rate, a main beat rate of 2.4 hertz, which is 132 BPM. So the top graph there, she just had them listen to it. And so the x-axis here is the frequency. So over to the left is slower beat rates, and over to the right is faster beat rates. And then the y-axis is how much the neurons were entraining to that frequency. So when they just listened to this stimulus, lo and behold, the main beat rate from the stimulus is what neurons started firing at. For the second and third panels here, she asked participants to imagine that they were hearing this beat rate in groups of 2 or in groups of 3. So if they were hearing a metronome like this, they would imagine it like 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of grouping the snaps in 2s. Versus 3s, they could go 1, 2, 3. And so just by virtue of imagining these different beat rates, different neurons would entrain to these grouping beat rates, of course. So you have 2.4 hertz in the binary meter imagery, and you get 1.2, so half that. So grouping them in 2s shows up. And the same thing for 3s. So this was taken as evidence that neurons can entrain, and that it doesn't have to be something that's present in the stimulus that's driving it. It can be endogenously driven. You can make these neurons fire that way if you want. And the way that they're firing is aligned with how you're perceiving the audio stimulus. Okay, so why? Why are neurons entraining to periodic stimuli that we hear, and why is this happening in motor cortex? So I think the one-line answer is prediction. So this is an XKCD comic. I don't know if anyone's familiar with XKCD, but I enjoyed it. So there's some things that we're not very good at predicting, and I think the weather is probably one of them. We're okay at it, but it's still pretty variable, as the past few weeks has come to pass. Although I think we were pretty good at predicting canceling this 2 weeks ago. It was pretty bad. But we're really good at predicting other kinds of things. So, I mean, there are rhythmic things all over the place in our lives. So the pace that we walk, and when we walk in a regular fashion, it's really easy to predict when the next step is going to fall when you see someone walk. Taking turns in conversation, I love as a great example of predicting timing, because it's not as strict an example as music might be. Music is really easy to see the patterns, but there's definitely a pattern and a cadence to someone's voice and the way that a conversation goes. And it sort of goes unknown to all of us, but we know exactly when the person's done the sentence, when they're finished that thought, and when they're ready to move on to the next one, and when it's okay for us to jump in, and that's all timing. And then obviously music is a really easy one. There's lots of patterns in music, and so it's really easy to describe how and why we can predict those kinds of things. So in music, for prediction, it's advantageous to synchronize with the underlying beat, because then no matter what happens, as long as the underlying beat stays the same, you can predict the next one. So we've already talked about this, but what about the desire to move? So that's the next thing I was interested in, was we have this framework for where and how and why the brain is doing this prediction, but how does it create a desire to move in somebody? I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So neurons and motor cortex synchronizing with the beat can be considered a model of the stimulus. So sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So in order to predict what's going to happen, you need to be able to model what's happening. So the beat is a great model of the music. So if it's a metronome and it's just going along regularly, and your neurons are firing along regularly as well, then you can, that's sort of your model of the stimulus. You can predict when the next one's going to happen. If it's a syncopated rhythm, then the model is probably going to be the underlying beat rate. So it's something that's regular, something that you can continue doing even in the absence of the stimulus, and you can still predict when things are going to happen. So that's sort of how this is working, is that the motor cortex is able to create a model of what's happening in the real world. Okay, so but what about the desire to move? How does music make us want to move? So I'm going to try and tie everything together here. So first, over time, the motor system learns how to move the body, and it learns the firing patterns required to walk, talk, and ride a bike. And it uses these patterns to predict when your foot will hit the ground next, and when to take turns in conversation, and when you can slam on the brakes. Music also involves rhythmic patterns, and when we listen to music, our neurons resonate with these patterns, and in so doing, the brain creates a model of the music. So premotor neurons have the expertise for these tightly timed patterns, and so they are really good at synchronizing with the beat and interacting with all the complex intricacies in the rhythm as it's tracking it. So for example, in a syncopated rhythm, where the model and the sound don't exactly match, so the syncopation isn't a regular beat, but the model is a regular beat, and you're using this model to predict it. So in that context, the brain has to work a little bit harder to spell out its model. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's sort of like in the face of a syncopated rhythm, you're trying to maintain a regular beat, and that takes some work to do. Now, the interesting thing is that this model that you're trying to reinforce seems to live in the motor areas of your brain, so the part of your brain that controls movement. And so in order to reinforce this model, to understand this syncopated pattern, one of the easiest ways to reinforce the model is to actually move your body, and so to let that model carry itself out and move. And of course, what comes with movement is it really bolsters the reinforcing the model, because now you've got sort of proprioceptive feedback. So when you move your muscles, that sends signals back to your motor cortex saying this is how we moved, and so it just further strengthens the reinforcing the beat that you're trying to model. So that's where I'll leave things. So that was a little short, but thanks for coming out. Special thanks to Caitlin for coordinating everything, and to Daniel for the Billie Jean demo. He gave me a big hand with that. So thank you.